Why are we fascinated by serial killers? Is it morbid curiosity about the human psyche? Is it a desire to comprehend the darkest corners of the human mind? Does modern-day media contribute to a culture of voyeurism? Whatever the reason, in this video we'll explore the 10 most notorious American serial killers. Wayne Bertram Williams is serving life imprisonment for the 1981 killings of two men in Atlanta, Georgia. Although never tried for the additional murders, he is also believed to be responsible for at least 24 of the 30 Atlanta murders from 1979 through 1981, also known as the Atlanta child murders. Williams first became a suspect in the Atlanta murders on the morning of May 22, 1981, when a police surveillance team watching the James Jackson Parkway Bridge spanning the Chattahoochee River, where multiple bodies had been discovered previously, heard a loud splash. The first vehicle to exit the bridge after the splash, at roughly 3 a.m., belonged to Williams. 2 days later, on May 24th, the nude body of 27-year-old Nathaniel Cater, who had been missing for 4 days and was last seen with Williams, was discovered in the river. Hairs and fibers retrieved from the body of another victim, Jimmy Ray Payne, were found to be consistent with those from Williams' home, car, and dog. Williams was arrested on June 21, 1981 for the murders of Cater and Payne. Williams was never tried for any of the Atlanta child murders. However, police attributed 22 other deaths, including those of 18 minors, to Williams. Williams is serving his sentence at Telfair State Prison. On November 20, 2019, Williams was again denied parole. He will next be eligible for parole in November of 2027. Juan Corona was a Mexican immigrant who suffered from schizophrenia. Corona migrated to the United States in 1950 when he was 16 years old. He found employment as a migrant farm worker in the Imperial Valley of California. In 1962, he received a green card and became a licensed labor contractor in charge of hiring workers to staff the local fruit ranches. On May 19, 1971, a farm owner who had used Corona to contract field workers noticed a freshly dug hole in his peach orchard, which was filled the next day. In the hole, they found the body of a man who had been stabbed and hacked to death. They subsequently located 25 migrant farm workers' bodies buried in peach orchards along the Feather River in Sutter County, California. Witnesses later told police that some of the victims had last been seen riding in Corona's pickup truck. In the early morning hours of May 26, 1971, police entered Juan Corona's home with a search warrant and arrested him. Evidence indicating his guilt was discovered and seized, such as 2 bloodstained knives, a machete, a pistol, and bloodstained clothing. There was also a work ledger that contained 34 names and dates, including 7 of the known victims. Corona was convicted of 25 counts of first-degree murder in 1973. He served out a life sentence in California State Prison and died in 2019 at the age of 85. Dean Corll abducted, raped, tortured, and murdered teenage boys and young men between 1970 and 1973 in Houston and Pasadena, Texas. He was aided by 2 teenage accomplices, David Brooks and Elmer Henley. On August 8, 1973, Dean Corll was shot and killed by one of his accomplices, 17-year-old Elmer Henley. Henley called the police to admit to the killing. The police read Henley his Miranda rights, and in response, Henley shouted, "I don't care who knows about it. I have to get this off my chest." While in custody, Henley admitted to being an accomplice to Corll's multiple murders. He then admitted that Corll had paid him up to $200 for each victim Brooks or he were able to lure into Corll's apartment. Corll is known to have killed a minimum of 28 victims. All were males aged 13 to 20, the majority of whom were in their mid-teens. Corll's victims were lured into his vehicle and driven to Corll's house, where they were restrained with handcuffs, stripped naked, tortured, sexually assaulted, and sometimes after several days, killed by strangulation or shooting. Elmer Wayne Henley and David Owen Brooks were tried separately for their roles in the murders. Henley was convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to 6 life terms to run concurrently. Henley's next eligible parole date is October of 2025, when he will be 69 years old. David Brooks was tried for the June 1973 murder of Billy Ray Lawrence in February of 1975. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. Brooks died of COVID-19 complications in May of 2020. Ted Bundy was one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. Bundy kidnapped, raped, and murdered dozens of young girls and women during the 1970s and possibly earlier. He would often revisit the bodies of those he'd murdered, grooming and performing sex acts on the corpses. He decapitated at least 12 of his victims, keeping their severed heads as mementos. On July 14, 1974, 2 women were abducted from a crowded beach at a state park in Washington. 4 female witnesses provided a detailed description of the perpetrator, who called himself Ted and drove a Volkswagen Beetle. Police finally had a detailed description of their suspect and his car. On August 16, 1975, Bundy was arrested in Utah after a traffic stop. Inside his car, police found burglary tools, ski masks, and other suspicious objects. Over time, Bundy's criminal activities continued to unravel, and he became a prime suspect in several murder cases spread across multiple states, including Washington, Utah, Idaho, Colorado, Florida, Oregon, and California. Finally, in 1978, Bundy was apprehended for the last time in Florida. Overwhelmed with evidence and facing multiple murder charges, he was put on trial. Despite representing himself and showcasing a manipulative demeanor, the weight of the evidence against him was substantial. In 1979, Ted Bundy was convicted of 3 counts of murder, 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, and burglary. He received the death penalty and was executed in the electric chair on January 24, 1989. At the time of his execution, Bundy had confessed to 30 murders, though the actual number of his victims remains unknown and may be higher. A seemingly ordinary man by day and an evil monster by night, John Wayne Gacy dressed up as a clown named Pogo to entertain children at parties. Meanwhile, Gacy murdered young men and boys in Norwood Park Township near Chicago, Illinois. He would lure a victim into his home and dupe them into donning handcuffs on the pretext of demonstrating a magic trick. He would then rape and torture his captives before killing them by either asphyxiation or strangulation. 26 victims were buried in the crawl space of his home, and 3 others were buried elsewhere on his property. 4 were discarded in the river. Gacy had previously been convicted in 1968 of sodomy of a teenage boy in Waterloo, Iowa, and was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, but he only served 18 months. He murdered his first victim in 1972 and had murdered twice more by the end of 1975. He murdered at least 30 victims after his divorce from his second wife in 1976. The investigation into the disappearance of teenager Robert Peist led to Gacy's arrest on December 21, 1978. Gacy was convicted of 33 murders. He was sentenced to death on March 13, 1980, and was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center on May 10, 1994. Active during the 1970s, Patrick Kearney targeted young men, primarily runaways and hitchhikers in California. He earned the nickname the Trash Bag Killer due to his method of dismembering his victims and disposing of their remains in trash bags along the highway. Kearney would pick up and kill young male hitchhikers or young men from gay bars. Starting in 1974, Kearney is estimated to have committed murders on almost a monthly basis. Kearney made a full confession, initially admitting to a total of 28 murders and subsequently to 7 more. In order to avoid a death sentence, he agreed to plead guilty. Kearney was charged with 21 counts of murder, and as agreed, pleaded guilty. Police are certain that Kearney was responsible for the other 7 murders he had admitted to, but lacked the physical evidence to charge him. As of 2022, Kearney is incarcerated at California's Mule Creek State Prison. Donald Harvey claimed to have murdered as many as 87 people, though official estimates are between 37 and 57 victims. The murders took place during his time as a hospital orderly between 1970 and 1987. Harvey claimed to have begun killing to ease the pain of patients by smothering them with their pillows. He gradually grew to enjoy killing and became a self-described angel of death. Harvey eventually used other methods to kill his victims, such as poisoning patients' IVs or turning off a patient's ventilator. He even inserted a coat hanger into a catheter, causing an abdominal puncture and subsequent peritonitis. After keeping his crimes hidden for 17 years, Harvey slipped in March of 1987. An autopsy on John Powell, who had died abruptly after spending several months on life support following a motorcycle accident, revealed large amounts of cyanide in his system. Harvey became a person of interest when investigators learned that he had been forced to resign the Cincinnati VA hospital after he was caught stealing body parts for occult rituals. When they brought Harvey in for questioning, he confessed to Powell's murder. Harvey agreed to a plea bargain if the death penalty were taken off the table. In 1987, Harvey pled guilty to 24 counts of first-degree murder. In accordance with the plea agreement, he was sentenced to 3 concurrent terms of life in prison. The plea agreement allowed prosecutors to seek the death penalty if more murders came to light. On March 28, 2017, authorities reported that Harvey had been found in his cell severely beaten. Donald Harvey died 2 days later as a result of the beating. Gary Ridgeway terrorized the Seattle area during the 1980s and 1990s, targeting mostly young women, prostitutes, and runaways. He would strangle his victims and dump their bodies near the Green River, earning him the moniker the Green River Killer. Ridgeway had been a suspect in the murder since 1982 when he was arrested for prostitution. However, investigators were unable to link him to the murders at that time. Later, advances in DNA profiling allowed investigators to definitively link Ridgeway to the murders, and he was arrested on November 30th, 2001. Ridgeway and his legal team agreed to a plea bargain wherein he would disclose the locations of still missing women. He was convicted of 49 murders. On December 18, 2003, King County Superior Court Judge Richard Jones sentenced Ridgeway to 48 life sentences without the possibility of parole to be served consecutively. He was also sentenced to an additional 10 years for tampering with evidence for each of the 48 victims, adding 480 years to his 48 life sentences. Later, he was given another life sentence after the remains of his 49th victim were found. In a taped interview, Ridgeway claimed to have murdered 71 victims and confessed to having had sex with them before killing them, a detail which he did not reveal until after his sentencing. In his confession, he claimed he began burying the later victims so that he could resist the urge to commit necrophilia. Ridgeway later said that murdering young women was his career. Between 1971 and 1983, Randy Kraft is believed to have killed 67 victims. All of his suspected victims were males between the ages of 13 and 35, the majority of whom were in their late teens to mid-20s. Kraft's victims were typically lured into his vehicle with an offer of a lift or alcohol. Once in Kraft's vehicle, the victims would be bound, tortured, and sexually abused before they were killed, usually by either strangulation, asphyxiation, or bludgeoning. The victims would then be discarded alongside various freeways in Southern California. By January of 1975, a total of 14 victims had been linked to the same killer. On May 4th, 1983, Randy Kraft was pulled over after police officers noticed him driving erratically. The police officer then observed a young man slumped with his eyes closed in the vehicle's passenger seat. Upon checking his pulse, the officer noticed that the man was dead, with a ligature mark visible around his neck. The victim's hands had been bound with a shoelace. After a thorough search of Kraft's car and residence, they secured a mountain of evidence which connected him to multiple murders. Kraft was formally charged on May 2, 1989. Kraft was found guilty of 16 counts of murder, 1 count of sodomy, and 1 count of emasculation. He was sentenced to death. Kraft remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison. He continues to deny responsibility for any of the homicide he was either convicted of or suspected of committing. Samuel Little was born Samuel McDowell on June 7, 1940 in Reynolds, Georgia. By 1975, Little had been arrested 26 times in 11 states for crimes including theft, assault, attempted rape, fraud, and attacks on a government official. Little was arrested on September 5, 2012 at a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky, and extradited to California to face a narcotics charge, after which authorities used DNA testing to establish that he was involved in 3 unsolved murders. All 3 women were killed and later found on the streets of Los Angeles. He was extradited to Los Angeles, where he was charged on January 7, 2013. A few months later, the police said that Little was being investigated for involvement in 36 murders committed in the 1980s, which until then had been undisclosed. Little admitted to more than 93 different murders in total, and 60 deaths have been formally connected to him by the police. But Little was convicted on only 4 counts of murder and was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Little died on December 30th, 2020 in Los Angeles. Be sure to subscribe, share, like, and comment, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next episode of Mysteries, Legends, and Lies.